The morning sun cast long shadows across the cobblestone courtyard of Buckingham Palace, as Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his red tunic for the 100th time. At 28 years old, he had served as a Queen's Guard for 6 years, standing, motionless for hours while tourists snapped photos and children pointed at his tall bearskin hat. Today felt different somehow, though he couldn't explain why. Marcus had grown up in a small village outside London, the son of a factory worker and a seamstress. His parents had saved every penny to give him a proper education, and joining the Queen's Guard had been his way of honoring their sacrifice. The position required absolute discipline, unwavering attention to detail, and complete obedience to orders. These weren't just suggestions. They were sacred rules that had been followed for centuries. The palace grounds buzzed with the usual morning activity. Tour groups gathered near the gates, cameras ready to capture the famous changing of the guard ceremony. Street performers positioned themselves at strategic corners hoping to earn a few coins from the crowds. Vendors pushed carts filled with souvenirs, their voices calling out prices in multiple languages. As Marcus took his position outside the main entrance, he noticed the crowd was larger than usual. A group of schoolchildren pressed against the iron gates, their teacher trying to keep them in line while explaining the history of the royal residence. Their excited chatter filled the air, mixing with the sounds of car horns and footsteps on pavement. Among the children, one small figure caught his attention. A boy, no more than 7 years old, stood slightly apart from his classmates. His clothes were worn but clean, and his dark hair fell across worried eyes. Unlike the other children who were laughing and pointing, this boy remained perfectly still, watching Marcus with an intensity that seemed far beyond his years. The child's teacher called for the group to move along to their next destination, but the boy lingered. He took a step closer to the gate, his small hands gripping the iron bars. Marcus maintained his rigid posture, staring straight ahead as protocol demanded, but he could feel the child's gaze burning into him. Something was wrong. Marcus had learned to trust his instincts during his military training, and every fiber of his being told him that this child needed help. The boy's lips moved silently, as if he were trying to speak, but no sound emerged. His eyes darted nervously around the courtyard, scanning faces in the crowd with the wariness of someone much older. The other children had moved on, their voices growing fainter as they followed their teacher toward Westminster Abbey. But this one boy remained frozen in place, his knuckles white as he gripped the gate. Marcus noticed bruises on the child's wrists, partially hidden by his long sleeves. Fresh scratches marked his face, and one eye showed the faint purple shadow of an old injury. A man in an expensive suit approached from behind the boy, moving with deliberate casualness through the crowd. He wasn't part of the school group. Marcus had been watching long enough to memorize every face. The man's smile seemed forced, his eyes cold as they fixed on the child. When he placed his hand on the boy's shoulder, the child flinched as if he'd been struck. Marcus felt his muscles tense beneath his uniform. Every instinct screamed at him to act, but his training held him in place. Queen's Guards were living statues, monuments to discipline and tradition. They didn't move, they didn't speak, and they certainly didn't interfere with civilians, no matter what they witnessed. The man began pulling the boy away from the gate, his grip firm on the child's arm. That's when it happened. The moment that would change everything. The boy turned back toward Marcus, and with movements so subtle that only someone trained in observation would notice, he began making a series of hand gestures near his chest. Pew. Signs were quick and desperate, hidden from everyone except the guard who stood directly in front of him. Marcus recognized them immediately. They were military hand signals, the kind used by special forces in hostile territory when silence was crucial for survival. But how could a 7-year-old child know these signs? The boy's message was clear and terrifying. Help me. Danger. Can't escape. Marcus's heart pounded against his ribs, but his face remained expressionless. Years of training had taught him to control every muscle, every twitch, every breath. Yet inside, his mind raced as he processed what he had just witnessed. The child's hand signals were perfect, too perfect for a civilian to know, especially someone so young. The man in the expensive suit continued dragging the boy toward a black sedan parked across the street. The child's feet barely touched the ground as he was pulled along, his small frame no match for the adult's strength. Other pedestrians walked past without a second glance, assuming they were witnessing nothing more than an impatient parent hurrying. A slow child. Marcus knew those hand signals because he had learned them during his time with the Special Air Service before joining the Queen's Guard. They were classified communication methods, taught only to elite military units and certain intelligence operatives. The fact that this child knew them meant one of two things. Either someone had trained him specifically for this moment, or he had been around people who use these signals regularly. The boy stumbled as the man yanked him forward, and for a brief moment his shirt sleeve rode up, revealing more bruises along his forearm. These weren't the typical scrapes and bumps that active children collected during play. They were deliberate marks, patterns that spoke of systematic abuse. Marcus had seen similar injuries during his military service in conflict zones, and the sight made his blood boil. The sedan's engine was running, exhaust fumes rising in the cool morning air. Through the tinted windows, Marcus could make out at least two more figures waiting inside. This wasn't a family outing gone wrong. It was something far more sinister. The boy was being taken somewhere against his will, and once that car door closed, he might never be seen again. Protocol demanded that Marcus remain at his post. The Queen's Guard had stood their ground during bombings, protests, and every manner of chaos for generations. They were symbols of unwavering duty, and abandoning his position would mean the end of his career, possible court-martial, and disgrace that would follow him for the rest of his life. But as the man reached for the car door handle, the child turned one final time. His eyes met Marcus's through the iron gates, and the boy's lips formed a single, silent word. Please. In that moment, Marcus saw his own childhood reflected in the boy's terrified face. He remembered being 7 years old, small and helpless, depending on adults to protect him from a world that sometimes seemed too big and too cruel. The difference was that Marcus had been surrounded by people who loved him, who would have moved heaven and earth to keep him safe. This child had no one except a guard who was bound by rules and tradition to do nothing. The car door opened with a soft click that seemed to echo across the courtyard like a gunshot. The man began pushing the boy toward the vehicle's dark interior, where other hands reached out to pull him inside. In seconds, it would all be over. The car would disappear into London's maze of streets, and Marcus would be left with nothing but the memory of a child's desperate plea for help. Time slowed as Marcus weighed his options. He could break protocol, abandon his post, and risk everything to save one child. Or he could maintain his discipline, uphold centuries of tradition, and live with the knowledge that he had chosen duty over compassion. The choice should have been simple. He had sworn an oath to follow orders without question. But as the boy's foot crossed the threshold of the car, Marcus made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He stepped forward, breaking formation, for the first time in 6 years of service. The movement was small, barely perceptible to most observers, but it was enough to send shockwaves through the watching crowd. A tourist gasped and pointed. Other guards at nearby posts noticed the deviation immediately, their own training alerting them to the breach in protocol. But Marcus didn't care about the consequences anymore. He had seen something that demanded action, and he would not stand by while an innocent child was taken into danger. The man with the expensive suit noticed the guard's movement and paused, his hand still gripping the boy's arm. For a moment their eyes met across the courtyard, and Marcus saw something flicker in the man's expression. Surprise, calculation, and then cold fury. This was not someone accustomed to being challenged, especially not by a ceremonial guard, who was supposed to be nothing more than a tourist attraction. The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Marcus continued his slow advance toward the gate, each step deliberate and measured. He couldn't run. That would cause panic and potentially endanger innocent bystanders. But he could use his presence, his uniform, and his training to create enough distraction to help the child. The man in the suit whispered something urgent to his companions in the car. Marcus caught fragments of the conversation, spoken in what sounded like Eastern European accents. They weren't tourists or businessmen. They were professionals, and the boy was clearly valuable to them for reasons that went far beyond a simple kidnapping for ransom. Other guards began moving toward Marcus's position, their own protocols kicking in. When one member of the Queen's Guard broke formation, others were trained to respond immediately. But Marcus held up his hand in a subtle signal, using the same military gestures the boy had shown him. The approaching guards understood. This wasn't a breakdown or a medical emergency. This was something else entirely. The crowd started to notice the unusual activity. Tourists who had been snapping photos began murmuring among themselves, sensing that something important was happening. A few pulled out their phones, switching from camera mode to video recording. Within minutes, the scene would be streaming live across social media platforms around the world. The boy used the distraction to his advantage. While the man's attention was focused on the approaching guard, the child twisted out of his grip and stumbled backward. He was small and quick, but he had nowhere to run. The sedan blocked one escape route, and the man's companions were already getting out of the car to help recapture him. Marcus reached the gate and did something that hadn't been done in living memory. He spoke while on duty. His voice was calm, but carried the authority of someone accustomed to command. "Excuse me, sir. I need to speak with that child." The man's facade of normalcy cracked slightly. "This is my nephew. We're late for an appointment. I'm sure you won't mind if I verify that." Marcus's hand moved to his radio, a gesture that caused immediate alarm in the group by the car. Standard security protocol when children appear distressed, near government buildings. The boy looked up at Marcus with a mixture of hope and terror. He was still too frightened to speak, but his eyes conveyed everything. This man was not his uncle, there was no appointment, and he desperately needed someone to help him escape whatever fate awaited him in that car. More guards arrived, forming a loose perimeter around the gate. They moved with practiced efficiency, their positions chosen to appear casual to onlookers while actually controlling all possible escape routes. The man in the suit found himself surrounded by 6 armed members of the Queen's Guard. Though none had drawn weapons or made overtly threatening moves, the situation was escalating beyond what any of them had planned. The original kidnapping, if that's what it was, had been meant to be quick and invisible, lost in the crowd of tourists and schoolchildren. But now it was becoming a public spectacle, with cameras recording every moment and security forces mobilizing in response to the guards' unexpected actions. A senior officer approached, his rank evident from the additional insignia on his uniform. Captain James Morrison had served for 15 years and had never seen one of his guards break protocol in such a dramatic fashion. He assessed the situation quickly, taking in the frightened child, the nervous adults by the car, and the growing crowd of spectators. "Sergeant Thompson," he said quietly, "explain yourself." Marcus knew this was the moment that would determine not only his future, but potentially the child's fate as well. He could back down, apologize for the breach of protocol, and allow the situation to return to normal. The boy would disappear into the car, and Marcus would face disciplinary action, but keep his position. Instead, he made a choice that surprised even himself. "Sir, I have reason to believe this child is in immediate danger." He communicated distress using military hand signals that civilians shouldn't know. "I request permission to detain these individuals until police can investigate." The captain's eyebrows rose slightly. Marcus had just made an official report, transforming what could have been dismissed as a momentary lapse in judgment into a formal security incident. There would be no quiet resolution now. This would require investigation, paperwork, and explanations all the way up the chain of command. The man by the car realized that his window of opportunity was closing rapidly. He made a subtle gesture to his companions, and they began moving toward the boy with increased urgency. Whatever their original plan had been, they were now prepared to abandon stealth in favor of speed. The tension reached a breaking point as the 2 men from the car moved toward the child with obvious intent. Captain Morrison, recognizing the shift in dynamics, made a swift decision that would validate Marcus's instincts. He keyed his radio and called for immediate backup from the Metropolitan Police, transforming what had begun as a potential disciplinary issue into an active security response. The boy, sensing the changing mood, ran toward the gate where Marcus stood. His small hands reached through the iron bars, grasping at the guard's red tunic as if it were a lifeline. Up close, Marcus could see that the child's injuries were even more extensive than he had first realized. There were rope burns around his wrists, suggesting he had been restrained recently, and his clothes bore the musty smell of a basement or warehouse. "Help me," the boy whispered in accented English, his voice barely audible above the growing commotion. "They took me 3 days ago. My father is Colonel Petrov, Russian military attaché. They want to trade me." The pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicked into place for Marcus. This wasn't a random kidnapping. It was an international incident involving diplomatic personnel. The boy's knowledge of military hand signals made perfect sense now. He was the son of a high-ranking military officer, someone who would have been exposed to classified communication methods from an early age. The man in the expensive suit realized that their operation was completely compromised. He barked orders, in Russian, to his companions, who immediately began retreating toward their vehicle. But the arrival of metropolitan police units at both ends of the street trapped them in place. The carefully planned extraction had become a public disaster. Captain Morrison approached the gate and knelt down to the boy's eye level. His voice was gentle but urgent. "What's your name, son?" "Dmitry Petrov," the child replied, his small body shaking with exhaustion and fear. "They said they would hurt my mother if I tried to escape. But I remembered what my father taught me about emergency signals." The captain exchanged a meaningful look with Marcus. If the boy's story was true, they had just prevented an international kidnapping that could have sparked a diplomatic crisis between Britain and Russia. The implications were staggering, and the decision to act on Marcus's instincts had potentially saved not only a child's life, but also prevented a major incident between two world powers. Detective Inspector Sarah Collins arrived within minutes, her unmarked car sliding to a stop behind the police barriers that were now surrounding the scene. She was a specialist in international crimes and had been called in as soon as dispatch realized they were dealing with potential diplomatic hostages. Her first assessment confirmed Marcus's worst fears. This was far more serious than anyone had initially realized. The men by the car made one final attempt to reach the boy, but they found their path blocked by a wall of police officers and guards. The lead kidnapper's calm facade finally cracked completely, revealing the cold professional beneath. He reached inside his jacket, causing immediate alarm among the security forces. "Armed suspect," someone shouted, and suddenly the tourist-friendly courtyard of Buckingham Palace transformed into a tactical situation. Civilians scattered for cover while armed officers took defensive positions. The changing of the guard ceremony, which had been scheduled to begin in 10 minutes, was immediately canceled as the area was secured. Marcus found himself in the strange position of being both a potential hero and a rule breaker who would face consequences for his actions. But as he looked down at young Dmitry, who was now safely behind the palace gates and surrounded by protective officers, he felt no regret about his decision to disobey orders. The boy looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than his 7 years. "Thank you," he said simply. "My father always said that good soldiers know when to follow orders and when to follow their hearts." Detective Inspector Collins began her preliminary interview with Dmitry, while medical personnel examined his injuries. The boy's account revealed a sophisticated operation that had been planned for weeks. The kidnappers had identified him during a school trip, followed him home, and taken him from his bedroom in the middle of the night, while his parents were attending a diplomatic function. The ransom demand hadn't been for money. It had been for classified military information that Colonel Petrov had access to through his position at the embassy. The kidnappers had given his parents 72 hours to comply, with strict instructions that involving law enforcement would result in their son's death. But Dmitry had been taught well by his military father. He had memorized escape procedures, recognized his captor's accents and mannerisms, and waited for the right moment to signal for help. His appearance at Buckingham Palace hadn't been coincidental. He had been brought there as part of the psychological pressure on his parents, a demonstration that the kidnappers could move freely through London's most secure areas. The arrest of the 3 suspects proceeded with military precision, each man taken into custody without the gunfire that everyone had feared. The weapon one of them had reached for turned out to be a phone, likely meant to signal other members of their organization about the operation's failure. Within hours, Detective Inspector Collins had coordinated with international law enforcement to apprehend 2 additional suspects at safe houses across London. Colonel Petrov arrived at the scene within 30 minutes of being notified, his diplomatic immunity allowing him to bypass normal security protocols. The reunion between father and son was deeply emotional, with the hardened military officer breaking down in tears as he held his child. Through a translator, he explained to the assembled officials that his family had been living in terror for 3 days, believing they would never see Dmitri alive again. The colonel's gratitude toward Marcus was profound and immediate. In heavily accented English, he approached the guard who was now facing potential disciplinary action for his breach of protocol. "Sergeant Thompson," he said, using Marcus's rank with the respect of one soldier addressing another, "you have saved more than my son's life. You have prevented war." This wasn't hyperbole, as subsequent investigations would reveal. The kidnapping had been orchestrated by a criminal organization with ties to extremist groups seeking to destabilize British-Russian relations. Had they succeeded in forcing Colonel Petrov to hand over classified information, the resulting intelligence breach would have created an international crisis that could have escalated beyond anyone's control. Captain Morrison found himself in an unprecedented situation. According to military regulations, Marcus had committed a serious breach of discipline that warranted significant punishment. However, the consequences of that breach had been the prevention of an international incident and the rescue of a diplomatic child. The case would require review at the highest levels of both military and government authority. Media attention intensified as news of the incident spread across social media and traditional news outlets. Videos recorded by tourists showed the dramatic moment when the Queen's Guard abandoned his post to help a child in distress. Public opinion was overwhelmingly supportive of Marcus's actions, with many calling him a hero who had chosen humanity over blind obedience to rules. The palace issued a carefully worded statement acknowledging that an incident had occurred and that all protocols had been followed to ensure public safety. Behind closed doors, however, senior officials were wrestling with how to handle a situation that had no precedent in modern royal history. The Queen's Guard had not broken formation to intervene in civilian matters since the Victorian era. Dimitri's medical examination revealed the full extent of his ordeal. Besides the obvious physical injuries, he showed signs of psychological trauma that would require months of counseling. The kidnappers had used sophisticated intimidation techniques designed to break his spirit and make him compliant. The fact that he had found the courage to signal for help demonstrated remarkable resilience for someone so young. The boy's testimony provided crucial intelligence about the criminal organization behind the kidnapping. Through his careful observation, during captivity, he had overheard conversations that revealed plans for similar operations targeting other diplomatic families. His information led to arrests across 3 countries and disrupted what investigators described as a sophisticated network of international criminals. Marcus spent the afternoon giving detailed statements to multiple law enforcement agencies. His military background and security clearance allowed him to provide insights that civilian witnesses couldn't have offered. He explained how he had recognized the boy's distress signals and why he had been convinced that immediate action was necessary to prevent a tragedy. The investigation revealed that Dimitri's kidnappers had been monitoring the family for weeks, learning their routines and identifying vulnerabilities. They had specifically chosen to bring him to Buckingham Palace because they believed the ceremony and crowds would provide perfect cover for their psychological manipulation of his parents. They had not anticipated encountering a guard with the training to recognize their victim's desperate attempt to communicate. As evening approached, the immediate crisis had passed, but its implications were just beginning to unfold. Marcus faced an uncertain future, knowing that his career with the Queen's Guard was likely over regardless of the positive outcome of his actions. Military discipline required consequences for breaches of protocol, even heroic ones. But in the quiet moments after the chaos had subsided, as he watched Dmitri being reunited with his mother at the embassy, Marcus felt a peace that he hadn't experienced since joining the service. He had followed his conscience instead of his orders, and that choice had made all the difference in the world to one frightened child and his family. 3 months later, Marcus Thompson stood in the same courtyard where his life had changed forever, but this time he wore a different uniform. The investigation into his breach of protocol had indeed ended his career with the Queen's Guard, but it had opened doors to opportunities he had never imagined possible. The disciplinary hearing had been a formality that everyone involved knew would result in his dismissal from ceremonial duties. However, the same officials who were bound to enforce military regulations were equally impressed by his judgment and courage under pressure. Within days of his official separation from the Queen's Guard, Marcus received offers from 3 different government agencies seeking to recruit someone with his unique combination of military training and moral courage. He had chosen to join the Diplomatic Protection Group, where his experience and instincts would be put to better use protecting embassy personnel and their families from the kind of threats that Dmitri had faced. The irony wasn't lost on him. By breaking the rules of one elite unit, he had qualified himself for another that valued initiative and independent thinking. The morning ceremony proceeded as it had for generations, with guards in red tunics standing at perfect attention while tourists snapped photos and children pointed in wonder. But now there was something different in the air, a sense that even the most rigid traditions could bend when humanity demanded it. The story of the guard who had broken formation to save a child had become legend, passed down through the ranks, as an example of when courage mattered more than protocol. Dmitri had made a remarkable recovery, both physically and emotionally. The counseling sessions had helped him process his trauma, and his natural resilience had carried him through the worst of his nightmares. His father had been reassigned to a posting in Geneva, partly for security reasons and partly to give the family a fresh start away from the memories of London. But the boy had insisted on returning to Buckingham Palace one final time before leaving Britain. He stood now at the same iron gates where he had made his desperate plea for help, but instead of fear in his eyes, there was gratitude and something else: determination. The experience had changed him, given him a perspective on courage and justice that would shape the rest of his life. Colonel Petrov accompanied his son, along with Detective Inspector Collins, who had become something of a family friend during the long investigation and trial that followed. The criminal organization had been dismantled completely, with sentences ranging from 15 years to life in prison for the various members. The intelligence gathered from their operation had prevented at least 4 similar kidnappings planned across Europe. Marcus arrived in civilian clothes, having finished his shift with the Diplomatic Protection Group. The reunion was warm and emotional, with Dmitri running to embrace the man who had risked everything to save him. The boy had grown taller and stronger, but he still bore faint scars on his wrists that served as reminders of his ordeal. "I brought you something," Dmitri said, pulling a small package from his jacket pocket. Inside was a military medal from his father's collection, one that Colonel Petrov had earned for exceptional service during a peacekeeping mission. "My father says real heroes don't always wear uniforms or follow orders. Sometimes they just follow their hearts." The inscription on the medal was in Russian, but the colonel translated it for Marcus: "For courage in the face of impossible choices." It was a recognition that transcended nationality, military rank, or diplomatic protocol, a soldier's acknowledgement of another soldier's willingness to do what was right regardless of the consequences. As they talked, other families with children walked past the palace gates, many stopping to take pictures and marvel at the pageantry. Some of the parents pointed out the guards to their children, explaining the history and tradition behind the colorful ceremony. But a few seemed to know the deeper story, pointing to the spot where a guard had once stepped forward when a child needed help. The incident had sparked changes beyond Marcus's personal situation. New protocols had been quietly implemented that gave guards more flexibility to respond to potential security threats, especially those involving children. The rigid discipline remained, but it was now tempered with recognition that sometimes the most important duty was to protect those who couldn't protect themselves. Marcus's decision that morning had ripple effects that continued to spread. Dmitri grew up to become a diplomat himself, specializing in international child protection services. The story of his rescue became part of his motivation to help other vulnerable children around the world. Colonel Petrov used his influence to improve security protocols for diplomatic families, ensuring that what happened to his son would be less likely to happen to others. As the sun set over London, casting the same long shadows across the courtyard that had marked the beginning of that fateful day, Marcus reflected on how a single moment of conscience had changed everything. He had lost one career but gained a better one, and more importantly, he had helped save a life and prevent an international crisis. The Queen's Guard continued their ancient ritual, standing motionless and proud as they had for centuries. But now everyone knew that beneath those imposing red tunics beat the hearts of human beings who, when faced with impossible choices, would choose compassion over protocol. Sometimes the greatest act of loyalty was knowing when to break the rules.